So first, Timothy, I'd like to know. Yesterday we were talking about supply chains, and I would like to know how to eliminate child labor in supply chains if we have exploitation of labor in a system that seeks profits.
It's a good question. One of the most important aspects of dealing with child labor and any other labor abuses in supply chains has to do with in enforcing more accountability and transparency in the corporations and the companies and the suppliers that make up the supply chain. There are roles for various organizations and elements to do this. One of those elements, which is often missing, is the role of the government in various countries to enforce their own laws and encourage companies to abide by the law in the country that they're operating in. That's one example. Another example would be being able to create opportunities for workers themselves to organize their own organizations, because they're the ones who really know what's going on in any given workplace or in any given supply chain that they're working in. If you empower workers to organize themselves, they themselves can improve their conditions, their living standards, their wages, so that it eliminates or reduces the incidence of child labor.
All right. We talked about the role of the system, and I would like to know what is the role of the state, the companies, and workers and union. They have to work together, or they have separate roles.
I think that it's important for all of these to work together. The problem is when you have a situation where there are stakeholder situations or stakeholder arrangements that exclude one or more of these very important stakeholders. Usually what happens is workers are excluded from the equation, which is ironic since they are really, one of the chief means of production in creating products. So what unions seek to do is build relationships. The only way that they can really improve the situation in a workplace is to actually have negotiations with employers and advocate for workers' rights and policies with governments. So all of them need to be involved, but the problem is often that workers are excluded from this equation.
Okay. And how can we eliminate child labor if we have informal labor and piracy, and we have to fight against that first, or how it's work?
The informal economy is a real huge issue, and of the 160-some million child laborers today in the world, about 63% of them are in agriculture. This presents a real challenge because it's hard for people to organize in the informal economy. It's hard, but it's not impossible. And there are examples of for instance, farm worker organizations, including migrant workers and undocumented workers who on a certain level don't even have the protection of the law, who have found ways through campaigning, through awareness raising, and through gaining support in coalitions with other organizations to be able to have those conversations to improve the situation of the workers in the field, and at the same time address the child labor problem that exists, for instance, in farming in countries like the United States.
Okay, and in a world vision, do you have some places that it's different from the other, or child labor and supply chains all over the world is mostly the same?
All of the supply chains for different products can be very, very different. Okay, let me give you just two examples.
Okay.
In the context of Bangladesh, for example, it has really huge worker rights issues. Okay, real problems for workers to be able to organize themselves and for the government to enforce their own laws. 20 years ago, because of international pressure, the Bangladesh government, along with organizations like the Solidarity Center and the International Labor Organization, made a concerted effort systematically to get child labor out of the garment factories. At that time, there were about 20,000 children in the garment factories in Bangladesh. It was a pretty clear supply chain. The suppliers in Bangladesh manufacturing garments for big brands. It was pretty direct in terms of who the stakeholders were and what the pressure was. There's still child labor can be found in some of the factories in Bangladesh, but it's not systemic and it's not in the same way it was 20 years ago. Contrast that with what's going on in Uzbekistan today. Uzbekistan's major export is cotton. Okay, cotton, when it hits the world market, gets mixed together with cotton from all kinds of different countries and sold on exchanges, which then are sold to countries that then go into the garments that we wear. Uzbekistan is one of the most egregious examples today of state-sponsored forced child labor. Every September when the cotton crop comes in, the government orders teachers, the schools are shut down, orders teachers and children into the fields to pick the cotton that essentially flows into the pockets of the ruling family that runs the government. So here you have an example with a more complicated supply chain, but a very, very clear example where you have state mandated and directed forced child labor. Those are two very, very different situations, and there are lots of different examples of this in different industries that will be, in some cases, more difficult to address, but in other cases there are opportunities that can be used to address child labor through these different pressure points.
Okay, and about United States, because we don't heard about much about child labor, but we know it has like everyone
Right.
of the country, and
There are laws on the books in the United States that were passed in the 1920s and 30s against child labor. However, the issue of child labor in the United States today primarily is in agriculture. There are at least 300 to 400,000 children who are working in agriculture in the United States, and this is the result of a combination of weak U.S. labor law and migration legislation that has put workers coming from other countries, Mexico, Central America, into a position where they are exploited by growers, the farm owners, to work for oftentimes lower than the legal minimum wage, and they work on a piece rate. So in order to make their quota, their family, including their children, have to become a part of the system. What these workers are trying to do is struggle to organize so that they can raise their wages and raise their conditions, which the Farm Labor Organizing Committee in the United States has been able to do in Ohio with some major food brands, and is working on trying to do the same in North Carolina with tobacco companies and tobacco growers. In that context, if workers are undocumented and may not even know what the law is, it really makes it very difficult for them to advocate for improving their situation because they're afraid that they'll be deported. This is a system that has been going on for decades and is exploited on the one hand by suppliers, by the farmers, and on the other hand, new progress is being made to really change this situation.
okay. Last question. I would like to know if you could make analyze it. You can, if you could analyze the global conference of child labor, these 3 days, and if it was positive and the next steps.
I think that this is a long-term process. Okay, addressing issues like child labor is a long-term process. I myself have been working on this for the last 20 years, but we see progress actually being made. To the extent that you can get workers, employers, and governments all agreeing to make it a priority, which has increasingly happened over the last decade, then you have the opportunity to have these pressure points for civil society organizations, for unions, for labor advocates, to hold governments and employers accountable and responsible for the language they agreed with in these conferences. So I think that's one of the major outcomes or major uses of this process that has been going on for the last, I think this is the third global conference. Last one was in 2010, and there will probably be another one in 2016.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, Timothy.
All right.
All right.